Back on the record, the time is 12:04.
And just to make sure the record remains clear, Dr. EGILMAN's continuing his response to the question, what's something you recall discussing with him, meaning Mr. Egdorf? Go ahead, Doctor.
And I object to the non-responsive answer.
It's been completely responsive.
Okay, so the next thing another thing that I recall discussing with Mr. Egdorf was the NCAA themselves acknowledged that they had an ethical and, quote, if not legal, imperative to keep up-to-date versions of this document, referring to the Medical Sports Handbook, okay, and available to the membership at all times. So they recognized at this time an ethical and legal need to do something about reducing concussions and injuries. And I, of course, from a public health perspective, agree with that. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. It took decades for them to update this. So in 1983, for example, the NCAA delayed funding the Sports Medical Handbook. In 1994, 22 years after Mr. Plett stopped playing, the NCAA did not include the term concussion in the handbook until 1994. Then, in 1997, the NCAA removed the criteria for return to play from the handbook. In other words, there were rules to not allow people to go back to play before 1997, so they de-worsified the program. They made their handbook worse. They made it less helpful. And they justified that by claiming that there was a, quote, lack of consensus, without citing anything. They just said, oh, there's no consensus. We can let the players just go willy-nilly back to play. No rules anymore. Now, it's interesting to note, and we discussed, Mr. Egdorf and I, that the NCAA didn't require consensus for anything else. They didn't say we need to have everybody agree when they decided who was going to be an all-star. We went over the specific things here. I don't remember them all, but we went over the things they needed, the things that they did without a consensus. It was in my report as well. I'll see if I can find that later. Because we discussed all those things that the NCAA made decisions on without a consensus. But apparently to protect people, everybody has to agree. To protect people's health, everybody has to agree. To pick the all-star team, not so much. Okay, then in 2006, the NCAA again was motivated to do something about things. What was that motivation? They got sued again by students who claimed they were damaged by the grant and aid cap. So, again, since their main interest was in money, they fought to keep the money away from the students. Because this was particularly related to the things I mentioned before. If you got injured, you didn't have 4-year contracts that they would pay for you to pay football, and if you got injured playing football, we'd still pay for you to go to school, which is, of course, allegedly the purpose of why you're at that school. You're not there to be just an exploited athlete so that the schools and the NCAA can make money off you. You're there to get an education. Well, they stripped people of their scholarships if they got injured. You're of no use to us anymore, the NCAA says. You can't play. Pay for your own scholarship. Pay for your own education. Okay. By 2009, Only one of the 16 sports mentioned concussion in the NCAA playing rules, and that was wrestling. Mentioned the word concussion. Okay. Then in 2010, there were congressional hearings and more lawsuits. Now the NCAA starts to take some action. They introduced the concussion protocol requirement to the playing rules because Congress may get involved. There may be some regulation here. So they do something else to try to avoid intervention by other people who are concerned about players' health. And they're told directly by Dr. Fred Mueller, sends a letter to David Klossner, the alleged head of health and safety. That was his title, but he was not powered to do anything. He would make recommendations that the NCAA should pass rules and regulations and improve things, and they wouldn't be implemented. They wouldn't be enforced. Okay. So what did Dr. Mueller tell Klossner, who was not a physician, of course, because they don't have a physician? Catastrophic injuries in high school and college football players, 1977 and 2008. The numbers are going up. Almost all are NCAA players. So they're looking at high school players and college players, but all the injuries that are getting reported, or almost all, are in NCAA players. And Mueller said, these numbers are not acceptable. And an all-out effort must be made to reduce them. Spearing. Remember spearing? Oh, apparently, still 2008, spearing is not regulated out of the game. He says, spearing, helmet-to-helmet contact, prohibition should be enforced. Why? Also, the NCAA had set a speed limit up. A speed limit said that you had to show someone was intentionally speeding, but they didn't have any radar detectors. There were no cops. There were no penalties. And they expected people to not speed? Not so. Dr. Mueller noted it was still a problem. Obviously, it's a problem. Even with cops and radar detectors, people speed. Without police, without radar detectors, or with broken radar detectors, you're not going to implement any reduction in speeding. In fact, if people know there's no radar detectors and no police, like they knew there was no enforcement of spearing, they're going to speed more than they otherwise would. It encourages speeding in a way. It's an anti-public health intervention, as Mr. Egdorf and I discussed. And he said, Mueller said, student athletes, he calls them by your name, this fake name. Okay? I call them workers, unpaid, uncompensated workers, indentured servants, should not return to play if they show signs of head trauma. During 2008 football season, there was the possibility of 8 second impact syndrome injuries. Now, Mr. Egdorf and I discussed that second impact syndrome is not well known and understood, and I need to explain that. You know how unwell known and ununderstood it is? Mr. Emmert, the head of the NCAA, the organization set up to prevent concussions and injuries, that was his purpose. He didn't even know what a second impact injury was when he was asked. Didn't even know what it was. 8 deaths in 2008. He didn't even know what it was. It's a death that happens instantaneously after an initial injury because of an instability in the control mechanism of blood and water flow into the brain, so that someone develops so much pressure from a second, and the second impact doesn't have to be a head impact. You can get hit hard on the shoulder after the first impact. And the brain loses control of fluid. and it fills with fluid, and the brain goes pushed through the brainstem, and the people die. That was how Mr. Sheely died. Okay. The NCAA created doubt over second impact syndrome. So not only did Mr. Emert not know what it was, but some of his agents tried to deny it was a real problem. Daniel Ducher said there's controversy surrounding the issue, creating doubt about what should be done about it. Well, Mueller had already told him what should be done about it. After the first injury, you get the player off the field so they don't get hit in the shoulder or the side or the head, so they don't die right there on the field, like Mr. Sheely did. So this was the NCAA adopting the tobacco company approach, creating doubt. The tobacco company said doubt is their product. They want people to doubt whether or not tobacco actually causes cancer. So here's the NCAA using the same strategy. Let's create some doubt about whether there is such a thing as second impact syndrome, so people don't worry about it and we don't have to do anything about it. So the NCAA adopts the tobacco model for an approach to a public health problem. And there's a little pamphlet they put out on that to create that doubt. Can you see this one, Chris? Because Mr. Egdorf and I looked at all the pictures in this PowerPoint.
Everyone.
Okay. Okay. So remember, we go back down to 1933. Look at this 1933. Here's what they recommended in 1933. All these things. Right? A picture from the handbook, the 1933 handbook. Why are we there? Because in 2009, after they got sued by Mr. Lloyd, as part of the condition of settling the lawsuit so they would save some money, because money's the thing that makes the NCAA move, they agreed to do some of the things that they said they should do in 1933. Okay.
Objection non-responsive.
And
Hold on. You said it like 7 times. You'll know when he's done with the answer. You don't get to interrupt his answer with your objection.
He wasn't speaking.
He'll tell you when he's finished. I promise you.
And so at that time, sickle cell disease got tested because of that Lloyd settlement. The Lloyds didn't want money. They wanted to save lives. And they forced the NCAA by suing them to implement sickle cell. Testing. It's particularly important because sickle cell disease is a disease in African Americans. And amongst all the athletes, there's another issue here that we discussed. The issue of race. Since many of the players in this time and place who are most exploited are African American. So it's particularly egregious, horrible, to not do something for the players who you're exploiting the most. Because the African Americans are much more dependent on the scholarships to get that education, because they're generally not from the upper class, those players playing in those sports. They're much more dependent on the money, and they're much more exploited and vulnerable to the NCAA cutting them off if they get injured. So, And then there was the Arrington settlement in 2014. So that required the NCAA, well, didn't require, as part of the settlement, the NCAA said they would enforce some of these rules. So Arrington, there's a suit, a lawsuit. They're going to lose a lot of money if they don't do something that they said they should do 85 years before, 90 years before. Oh, pardon me, I'm off by a decade. 80 years before. Okay. So in 1970, some other things the NCAA didn't do that they wrote that they should do in their own documents. In 1970, the NCAA writes that trainers would greatly reduce injuries. And they knew that letting students teach their peers was an effective way of preventing injuries. Peers, people who are the same age, same demographics, have great influence over their peers. So they know that in 2014, they don't do anything about it. They don't do any training for the student trainers. They don't do any peer education. Okay. We didn't discuss informed consent. Okay, so that's what we discussed from this PowerPoint. Then, we also discussed all of the anti-warnings in one section. These are the things that the NCAA did to falsely reassure the public that they were doing something about the problem so they could protect revenue. Okay. So in 1933, the NCAA claimed that medical supervision had proven effective to reduce injuries in their handbook. But they never implemented any kind of program like that for head injuries. This claim was an anti-warning. From between 1960 and 1964, in the official collegiate football guide, they said, you can expect football to be a rough game. President Robert Ray said, America needs a rugged contact sport for its youth. No other sport allows such valuable body contact, coordinated in a team effort. The official collegiate handbook of football, 1963. Football is and should be an aggressive, rugged contact sport. So all these injuries, they should be there because that's what we need to keep football going, to keep the revenue stream going. In 1971, the NCAA News said, it should never be forgotten that the prime consideration of all football rules is the protection of the player. I talked to Mr. Egdorf about all the things we've already talked about here. Clearly that was not the truth. Again, that was false reassurance, telling the public they would do something when they weren't. Or when they were, in the case of the helmets, making things worse, hiding from players the information that they had that the helmets were defective, keeping it a secret. Like all these documents that I've brought here today, they're all stamped confidential, or nearly all, because the NCAA doesn't want the public to know what they haven't been doing, how callous they've been. So we discussed, Mr. Egdorf and I, a lot about the secrecy problem, because it's my view from a public health perspective. If all of these documents become public as they now are, because of this trial and this deposition, this will be the end of the NCAA's ability to hide the problem, to create a false impression that they're doing something a problem. This secrecy ends here today. And I told Mr. Egdorf that. I told him that's why I wanted to testify, or that's why I was willing to testify, only because testifying would shed light on the problem. And as Justice Brandeis said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And this entity, the NCAA, is infected as anybody I've ever seen, as anybody with a blood infection throughout their body. This is an infected entity. This needs antiseptics and some medicine, some antibiotics, some truth medicine. That I discussed with Mr. Egdorf. Because I discussed with Mr. Egdorf the 76A rule and getting these documents released. And the fact that there's no 76A hearing in this case. And so that this material will become public. And people will see for their own eyes what the NCAA has been hiding all these years about their unconscionable conduct that's allowed workers to get injured and die and suffer in the meantime.
Objection non-responsive.
Stop.
He wasn't speaking.
It doesn't matter if he's speaking or not. You're not supposed to make that objection until he's done with the answer. You've already said it 12 times.
I'm not sure when
Just
he's
because
done.
you can't make... I told you he'd tell you when he's done, didn't I? Didn't I?
I'll
So
tell
just
you
keep-
what.
Just keep munching on the candy and texting, and he'll tell you when he's done, okay?
I'll tell you what. I'll let you know when I'm done. It won't be a secret. No problem.
That's why we're here, because your client's as disinterested in all of this as you are today.
That is not true.
So,
You've shown it.
so what I told Mr. What I talked to Mr. Egdorf about, what I told him about, okay, and what I showed him was waiting 106 years for an organization with $1 billion budget, which was established to protect worker safety, to hire a single chief medical officer is not slow. It's an abrogation of responsibility. It's an abdication of responsibility. It's an avoidance of responsibility. It's evidence that the NCAA was from the beginning a fraud, designed to give the false impression that colleges were protecting workers when they were doing no such thing. And I showed this graphic to Mr. Egdorf. The NCAA is as phony as a $3 bill that's worth $1 billion. Because the NCAA is worth $1 billion. Okay? And most years the NCAA spent trivial amounts, less than $10,000 on health and safety. Even now, after all the public outcry, after everything, it makes over $1 billion a year, and they could stretch to maybe $20 or $30 million for mostly long-term research projects, not doing things that actually, not investigating schools to see if they're complying, not seeing if schools, they don't even require schools. They don't check to see if schools have a program to deal with concussions. There's a rule. You have to have a program. What it is, there's no rule for. You could say whatever you want. But even then, they don't even check. There's no checking to see whether any school even has a protection program for concussions. Okay, so this is Nichols' quote. I can't remember the year, but we discussed all these PowerPoints, Mr. Egdorf and I. And this is what Nichols said, quote, "There's no profit in playing a cripple." Well, that's not exactly correct. Because the NCAA creates cripples, and they make a lot of money. And even if there's no profit in creating cripples, there's no cost to the colleges in creating cripples, because they lose their health coverage when they get injured and they're no longer students. They're out on their own. They lose their scholarships if they're out on an injury from football. So maybe there's no profit. I would dispute that. But there's certainly no cost to the NCAA. No health insurance. No play, no health insurance. No compensation for lost income. So this is what we call externalization of costs. In other words, the profits go to the NCAA. The costs of those profits can be measured in how players are injured. Those are the real costs. It's not the cost of building a stadium. It's not the cost of building the training facility. Oh, they pay those costs, the schools do. But the costs of injuring the workers, those costs are on the back of the workers and their families. Those are the real costs, because there's no compensation that can pay for a death or an injury that results in your loss of mental abilities. Think of how ironic that is. You're going to a college to develop your mental skills, your brain, your intelligence. And you play a sport that the school's making thousands or millions of dollars from. And you lose your ability, you're worse off than you were when you went. And the whole purpose of you going to school was to improve your mental ability so you could improve your status in life. And you bear those costs, and the schools profit, and the NCAA profits. And what's the pay, by the way? What is the pay? Oh, well, the students get tuition. What's the marginal cost? What's the extra cost to the university of adding 20 students to an enrollment of 5,000, 10,000, or Big Ten school 30,000? They don't add more faculty. They don't add more classrooms. There's no cost there. Lots of profit, no cost. Okay? And Nocera noted, okay, that Branch noted, the majority of athletes who played college football and men's basketball, which is where most of the profits come from to the NCAA, are African American. Okay? Look at the money we make off. This is Dale Brown, a coach at LSU. So he's part of the exploiter class, commenting on who they're exploiting and how they're exploiting them, how they're taking money from them. Look at the money we make off. This is a quote. Look at the money we make off predominantly poor black kids, close quote. Quote, we are the whore masters. His word. In the most incendiary line in his article, Branch wrote that the NCAA, he wrote it down. The NCAA lets off, quote, the unmistakable whiff of the plantation. Because there are analogies to be made between how slaves were treated and how football players are treated, particularly on safety and health. And I put this in my report, and we discussed this. Because before me, the comparison was indentured servants. No. Slaves were treated better for health and safety. Do you know why? Because the slave owners cared if their slaves got injured they would lose revenue. So there was actually medical programs that the slave owners put in specifically to treat their slaves. They hired doctors to treat the slaves, unlike the NCAA. The slave owners had hospitals for the slaves, or clinics at least, because they recognized the slave was theirs for life. If a slave couldn't work, they were going to lose revenue. The NCAA, they don't care about their equivalent. Because if one guy gets injured, they just get another one off the shelf. So. Okay, then we discussed the fact that the NCAA was a monopoly, a cartel. In other words, if you want to play football, it's not like there's two leagues. You got to go to a place where the NCAA controls the show. There's no competition. There's no normal capitalist protection where some league could say, come play for us and we'll treat you better. No, it's a monopoly game. And the NCAA controls the monopoly. Okay, and just want to get the years down. Before the 2011-2012 season, NCAA institutions were only permitted by the NCAA to give 1 year, quote, contracts, essentially, not quote, but 1 year deals, okay? They were renewable or cancelable entirely at the coach or the school's discretion. How's that? Indentured servants who came here from Europe in the 1720s had better deals than that. They had firm contracts that couldn't be broken. If they got injured, they still had a deal. Not so the players of the NCAA until 2011. Same thing still goes on now because the NCAA controls when you want to go to another school, you can't play for a year. Of course, those rules don't apply to the people at the NCAA. The coaches, they don't have a waiting period. They can switch schools, but not the players. When we discuss these tables, these are the comparisons between colonial indentured servants and NCAA workers. So let's compare and see who had a better deal. Is it the people who came here signing contracts to get their board paid on the ships to get to the United States? Or is it the NCAA football players who have a better deal? Well, let's see. The indentured servants, they get a free trip to the United States. They get room and board. They get the chance to learn a trade. And if they fulfill their contract and serve their masters without pay for 4 years or so, they're free. Well, let's look at the NCAA worker. He gets to spend 4 or 5 years earning money for his school. He gets paid nothing. He gets room and board and tuition and coaching. And as we said, he's on a 1 year cut contract. So if he gets injured, he's out the door till 2011. Who has a better deal? I think the indentured servant. Okay? Now, let's look at their future prospects. Now, the indentured servants, they didn't have the money to pay their way to the better world, and they had a tough time. They had a bargain. They either stay behind in Europe and not do well, or they could make that trade. Hope for training and hope for bettering themselves. What are the prospects of the average college athlete having a successful professional career? They're actually quite small. What's the graduation rates amongst basketball players? Why, there's a whole construct now, one and done. You go for a year, and then you leave. Or you get cut. You get cut for whatever reason the coach wants to cut you. You lose your scholarship in 2 You're done. Can't do that with an indentured servant. You're wedded together for that 4-year period. Not so for the student athletes. Okay. How about earnings? The indentured servants, they earn less than free laborers, but they got some money. Okay? And they got some room and board, etc. Whereas the NCAA athletes, now the owners of these indentured servants, they weren't making the kind of money the owners of these students are. They weren't multi-millionaires like the coaches or Mr. Emert or the other heads of the NCAA board. They weren't making that kind of money, these owners, these people who had indentured servants. No. They were better off than the servants, but not that kind of a disparity. Not a $5 or $10 million a year coach disparity compared to a player with limited ability to eat pasta. So most of the value that the NCAA athlete, most of that value goes to the ownership, goes in cash to the coaches, the athletic directors, and the officials of the NCAA. So on a money basis, they're far more exploited. They create lots of value for the owners. Okay? Indentured servants, they were in a competitive market. They could compete with different companies that wanted to pay their way to the United States. They could negotiate better terms. They could even negotiate a reduction in the length of service. And they could earn money and pay cash and get out of some of their years of service. How about the NCAA workers who play basketball and football? They got a cartel to deal with. They can't negotiate their own deal. It's fixed by the NCAA, the terms of their contract. And there's deals. The NCAA sets limits, tight limits. How much can the room be worth? How much board? Tuition? Required books and supplies? All limited. And they enforce those rules, unlike the concussion rules. If you're caught paying a worker, student worker who plays football, why, you can get sanctioned. And they enforce those sanctions. Now, if you're caught telling your player to spear somebody, no, they don't enforce those rules. So, indentured servant, check a box for them. They have a better deal. Okay? Indentured servants, they had 30 days of their contracts to be bought out by a family member, so they could buy out of their contract. Student athletes, once they sign their letter of intent, they can't get out of that letter of intent. They're stuck. Check box for the indentured servants. Better deal. Penalties for servants who breach their contracts range from extending the contracts, okay, to double, or as much as a 10-to-1 penalty authorized in Maryland. Okay, so that's pretty severe. NCAA bylaws, any athlete who transfers to a member institution on the same divisional level must complete a full year of residency before being eligible to play. So they lose a year of eligibility. They have to sit out for a year. unless they want to stay an extra year and go to school to play football. Again, indentured servants. They were chattels of their master. The contracts were bound, could be bought and sold at will. Well, that's kind of similar. NCAA institutions could only grant scholarships to college, quote, athletes, people who played sports, worked at sports, on a one-year basis. It was renewable or cancelable, up to the school, up to the coach. Coach could get rid of an athlete who did not fit into their system, who was not developing as quickly as hoped. Players not hitting those three-point shots. Players not catching those long passes. Cut. No scholarship. Till 2011, which covers the time period of Mr. Pletz. Okay. So, that's them.
Doctor, I don't know how much more you have on this answer. You are getting close to the time you wanted to think about breaking for lunch, so just keep that in mind as you're...
Okay. Well, I think we could do another section of things we talked about.
Okay.
It's all here on the table in front.
You plan to go through each one of those folders?
I plan to answer your question, sir. Okay? We discussed each one of these folders. We discussed everything in these folders. Okay? So, I plan to answer your question. I took an oath to answer your questions, truthfully. I don't know if you remember that at the beginning. I took that oath. I aim to fulfill that oath.
Objection, non-responsive.
Go back to the pending question, please, Doctor.
I just have a question. Was that non-responsive on the interjected question? Do you plan to go through each of those folders? Or was that a non-responsive to the basic question I've been answering all day long that you asked?
I don't believe you're answering the question that I asked, but the answer to your question is both.
He's
Proceed.
told you in the middle, well, first of all, you asked him, is he going to go through those? He said yes. I don't know how he could be more responsive. Your question, what's something you recall discussing with him? He's told you repeatedly during this that he discussed this with me. That couldn't be more responsive. If you want to stipulate that you asked a bad question, we can do that. But don't insult us by saying it's not responsive.
Just making my record.
Yeah,
Okay.
the record is your question. How many times have you heard him say, I discussed this with Mr. Egdorf, which is exactly what you asked him?
Okay, so this is the purple there, the motive section. Okay. So what makes the NCAA do something about worker health and safety? And just in case it's not clear, I don't adopt the NCAA fake construct of, quote, student athletes. They are workers. The NCAA profits from their work and doesn't treat them like students. If they treated them like students, they'd have scholarships to go to school. And if they got injured or couldn't play, they'd still have the scholarship to go to school. So they're workers, not student athletes. The NCAA was more concerned with liability than worker health. So we got some, as Mr. Lennon said, the answer's in your documents, the NCAA documents. So we went over some of the NCAA documents that answered the question about what makes the NCAA do something about worker health and safety. Okay? So let's Klausner, this guy who was the head of health and safety for the NCAA. Okay. So, by the way, I don't recall seeing where he reported, okay? But the current medical director, and we discussed this, he doesn't report to Mr. Emert, the head of this organization. He reports to a lawyer, okay? A lawyer with no medical training, no health training, no public health training, as far as I could tell from the record. That lawyer makes decisions about health and safety. How do we know that? The privilege log. all these discussions between the lawyer and the health and safety people on issues related to health and safety, the lawyer's making the decisions. Heinlein testifies about that. So this is health and safety by lawyers, which gives you an idea about what's really motivating them. Right here, that's what's motivating them. Liability. Okay? You put a lawyer in charge when you're afraid of lawsuits and liability. You put a doctor in charge when you want to deal with health and safety. So the NCAA has a lawyer in charge. Klausner raised concerns about the Playing Rules Oversight Panel. This is 2010. Okay? 2010. More than 100 years after the organization was founded to prevent football injuries and deaths. Okay? What's he right? He's concerned about the coach's education for the rule book and fact sheet. Okay? This is, this is a secret document. So let me give you the reference to it, since it's no longer going to be secret. It's no longer secret now. NCAA 10054-651-53. Okay? I'm concerned about this paragraph. An athlete who exhibits signs and symptoms or behaviors consistent with a concussion, either at rest or exertion, should be immediately removed from practice. This is the proposed rule. Or competition, and should not return to play until cleared by an appropriate healthcare professional, period. Sports have injury timeouts and player substitutions so that student athletes can get checked out and the team can perform at its best. What does Rachel Seawald write to Mr. Halpin and Teresa Smith about this proposed rule? And this is an email to Halpin. I thought we were trying to avoid this language in the rules books. Won't someone, i.e. officials, be liable even if this language just appears in the appendix? See, they'd already taken it out of the rules, but they just wanted to put it in there somewhere so that someone would know that this is what they should do to reduce injuries. They don't even want it in the appendix because they're afraid, this will establish, someone can say, well, you didn't do this. And if you write it down and say you should do it, then that'll be evidence that you didn't do what you should do. So instead of doing that, let's just not put it in at all. Let's not deal with it at all. That's concern over liability, not worker health and safety. But Seawald responded, don't worry. The rules don't count. They're only recommendations. They're not a requirement. They can't be enforced. What does Ty Halpin write? I think the use of should versus shall is important here. They don't want to say you shall do this. Why? But I also had the same thought. I'd like to be sure that we're clear that this is educational and not directed to officials as a requirement. Game officials are instructed to defer to appropriate medical personnel because the officials work for the NCAA and they might be sued if they didn't do a shall. But if you don't put in shall, then it may not happen. And if you don't enforce it, because you can't enforce it, because it's a should, not a shall, then it isn't going to happen. So this is putting public health behind concern over getting sued. Okay? Now we have Teresa Smith, who's the assistant director of the Playing Rules Administration. She recommended that the information be included, but was worried about liability. Are the refs? They're not worried about health and safety. There's no mention in these emails about reducing concussion or not reducing concussion. That's not a reason to do it or not do it. No, it's all about, will we get sued? Will we lose money? Are the refs more at risk if we don't provide the educational piece on concussions, or if we do provide it? In other words, if we keep silent, maybe that's worse for us for liability reasons. No mention here about which is better to protect the workers from getting killed. That's what we're talking about, workers getting killed. That's not in these emails. There's no discussion about which way is the rule going to be more effective for preventing people from getting injured. That's not here. What's not here, it's like the dog that didn't bark in Sherlock Holmes. Tells the tale. But let's see what they want to talk about in terms of rules. And what about the NCAA? Would we be, quote, protecting / helping the organization by not providing the information? Can we protect the organization by not telling people to remove people after a severe injury? They care about the NCAA, nothing about the player, nothing about the worker they're making billions of dollars off of. Would we be making available educational material that could be helpful in a future situation? Since CSMAS has made it available, I think it would be wrong not to include it. So CSMAS has recommendations, but they're discussing whether we should even want to make those public. So the second theme here is, so they make decisions thinking about how it's going to affect lawsuits, but lawsuits do affect their decisions when they get sued, okay? Because they only act to protect workers' well-being when they get sued, okay? So let's look at some examples of those. The Lloyd case we discussed, and he didn't have the case. Mr. Egdorf didn't have the case. I had to get that from the Lanier law firm and what the settlement was, okay? So I got this from the Lanier law firm. The NCAA only mandated sickles, and you know what? Before they gave me this, they had to check to make sure this secret agreement wasn't still secret. So they didn't want, God forbid, people should know that what makes the NCAA move is threat of getting sued and losing money. The NCAA only mandated sickle cell tests following a student death and a related litigation settlement. Dale Lloyd died September 9, 2006, when he fell unconscious on the practice field after sprinting 100 yards for the 16th consecutive time. He died the next day from complications associated with sickle cell trait, because people with sickle cell trait are more susceptible to clotting when they get dehydrated in the heat. Now, how much would it have cost to know if he was at risk for that? So the coaches would know not to run 1,600-yard sprints in the heat? $10. $10 for $1 billion organization. $10 was too much until they got sued. Then they recommended the test, required the test even, in order to avoid paying in the lawsuit. Because the Lloyds didn't want money. They wanted to make sure the next Dale Lloyd didn't die. They cared about health and safety, unlike the NCAA. And here's what Elsa Cole, the legal counsel for the NCAA, said. A recommendation was, quote, brought up as a way to resolve the litigation, and we agreed to it, close quote. That's a quote from USA Today. Awful nice of them, with a gun to their heads, to hold their hands up and do a $10 test that could save people's lives, African American lives. The most exploited of the exploited. And then, how about the Medical Science Committee? Sounds like a good idea for an organization created to protect the health and safety of football players Well, they formed one in 2014. Now, where does that appear? Why, that appears in the settlement and release agreement from the Arrington from the Arrington lawsuit. Right here, Section 5A. Medical Science Committee will be formed as follows. This is from the lawsuit, to settle the lawsuit. Not by the NCAA committees, not by Mr. Emert, not by any of the colleges or universities. By the way, there are about 150 medical schools that are part of universities that are part of the NCAA. None of them do a thing. The NCAA hasn't asked them to do a thing, doesn't ask for their help in reducing injuries and illnesses in workers. There's no organization in the world with more medical talent at their disposal. With more, what are these things? They are educational organizations. That's what they do for a living. They do healthcare research for a living. There's no organization that has more talent and ability to throw at a problem like health and safety than the NCAA and its member institutions. And not once have they made a call. Not once have they said, let's get all the medical schools together. Let's see what we can get for their talent. Let's see how we can throw them at this problem of their students dying. No, not even a call for help. From the hundreds of thousands of talented physicians and others who could be used to address this problem. Many of whom I'm sure would do it for free. Because they don't want their students dying. But they're not asked. So the Arrington class action lawsuit, let's go to the agreement. That's the reason. That's the reason for this medical science committee. 1, the parties have agreed on the appointment of 4 medical experts with expertise in the diagnosis, care, and management of concussions in sport and mid to late life neurodegenerative disease to the Medical Science Committee, and they specify who they are. Brian Hainline, Robert Cantu, Ruben Eshmandia, and a 4th who meets the selection criteria of another paragraph, is selected by the chair of the Medical Science Committee after consultation with the parties. And the Honorable Wayne R. Anderson retired as the chair of the Medical Science Committee. So it took a lawsuit to set up a committee with doctors to address these issues. That's what makes the NCAA move. Not their moral and ethical obligation, not the fact that they claim they were set up to eliminate these problems. No, you have to sue them and threaten them with losing money. It's all about the money. Okay. And how about those mandatory checkups that we talked about that were discussed in 1933 or so? The NCAA only required mandatory medical checkups in 2014 as part of the Arrington settlement. What a surprise. In the lawsuit settlement, Section 8, return to play guidelines, academic accommodations, and concussion education. They had to be sued to do concussion education. There are 1,300 educational institutions. They do education for a living. They have experts in communication and media. They have the world's resources right here, the best academic places in the world for these things, and they don't do anything. They don't use any of them. And they have to be forced in a lawsuit to even think about it and set something up. Here it is. Okay. A, the parties agree, subject to the proper NCAA rulemaking process. So there has to be a little wiggle room here, even for the NCAA here. Defined in Section 8B, the NCAA and or its member institutions will implement the following return to play guidelines. 2014. Mr. Pletz is dead. Every student athlete at every NCAA member institution will undergo preseason baseline testing for each sport in which they participate prior to participating in practice or competition. An NCAA student athlete who has been diagnosed with a concussion will be prohibited from returning to play or participating in any practice or game on the same day on which he or she sustained the concussion. Just the same day. The NFL, much better than that. High schools, much better than that. But the NCAA fought to limit it. But this was a concession. Medical standards, mandatory medical checkup. Mentioned in the 1933 handbook, adopted 2014. Not all, but some. It took 81 years and a class action lawsuit to enforce these rules in any way, the ones developed in 1933. Same thing for helmet standards. I mentioned those before. Developed so they could defend lawsuits. And let me give you the quote because I didn't give you that before. In 1970, the NOCSAE, which was set up to do these helmet things, was, quote, advised to talk to Walter Byers about incorporating the committee with the hope of preventing court litigation and or liability, close quote. Couldn't be any clearer than that. Here it is in black and white. Why do they set up the Committee on Helmets? To avoid lawsuits and liability. Stamped confidential, I think, this document. The NCAA doesn't want people to know why they do things. Minutes of the NCAA Competitive Standards, Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports, 1970. Just so you think that that's not a one-off, here's another part of the minutes. There's an urgency to come up with positive. Now there's an urgency. Oh, we better do something. Why? Because of present lawsuits against manufacturers. Not even lawsuits against the NCAA. They want to help the manufacturers, not the players. They're interested in doing something to protect the manufacturers. Okay. So here's all a summary of the legal issues on one page. Okay. 1905, public outrage, threat to football, formed the NCAA. 1909-1910, NCAA formed, injuries go up. Quote, the threat of radical remedies, even abolition, that's not abolition of slavery, that's abolition of football, has convinced the administrators and rulemakers that change was inevitable, close quote. Lawsuits in the 50s formed CSMAS. Helmet manufacturers' lawsuits create the NOCSAE to make standards that which, if complied with, will avoid lawsuits. Okay? That language, quote, standards which, if complied with, avoid lawsuits, that comes from an Industrial Hygiene Foundation document. Because while the NCAA is doing this, that was developed by other companies in the 30s to defend against asbestosis and silicosis lawsuits. So this is a well-known technique. Companies who do something wrong create a standard so they can keep getting away with it. Nothing the NCAA invented, they just adopted industry standards for how to avoid paying people when they injure them. CSMAS, quote, feels the association has a strong ethical, if not legal, this is 1958. 1981. Feels the association has a strong ethical, if not legal, imperative to keep up-to-date versions of this document available to the membership at all times. Well, that was actually earlier, and this is 1981. The medical handbook was created. Then we've got the GIA-GAP. The board of directors sought to allow, there was lawsuits about the scholarship issues getting cut off. The NCAA, 2006, the NCAA board of directors allows but doesn't require schools to offer their most valuable recruits. This is a language. This is interesting language. Quote, the NCAA board of directors sought to allow but not require schools to offer their most valued recruits. That's a value. Money is the value there. An annual cash payment up to $2,000. Mark Emer testified in front of the Senate, 2010. 3 weeks later, the NCAA settled the Arrington lawsuit. More pending lawsuits. 2010, the concussion protocol requirement. Sickle cell lawsuit. Mandatory medical checkup for sickle cell trait. Well, we stopped and we'll take a lunch break, and I'll come back and do some more of our conversations.
Ready to take a break, Steve? Stephen?
Sure.
I mean, I can go
Going
on
off
if you
the-
want.
Going off the record, the time is 1:11.